The sawmill worker leaned against the loader, arms crossed, watching an old Ford pickup sag lower and lower under a load of the ugliest lumber he'd ever seen. Crooked boards, cracked slabs, bark-edged offcuts nobody in 3 counties would pay a dime for. "You know that's reject pile, right?" he called out. "That's the stuff we can't even give the pallet guys." Jack Coyle didn't look up. He kept stacking, working a warped board into the gap between 2 others like he was solving a puzzle. Only he could see. "I know what pile it is. Firewood's out back if that's what you're after. Better wood for it, too." Jack straightened, wiped his hands on his jeans, and looked at the man for a long moment. "Wasn't planning on burning it." He climbed into the truck. The engine turned over rough, caught, and the loaded Ford rolled out of the yard in a drift of sawdust, springs groaning with every pothole. The worker laughed and shook his head. 3 other men laughed with him. 8 months later, that same worker would be standing in Jack Coyle's driveway before sunrise, hat in his hands, asking if there was any way at all, Jack could build him one too. Nobody at that sawmill would ever explain it right. They didn't understand it themselves, not really, not until they saw it finished. And even then, most of them still didn't understand why nobody had thought of it first. Jack Coyle was 68 years old and had farmed the same 80 acres outside of Millhaven his whole life. He wasn't the kind of man people described as clever. Careful, maybe. Quiet, certainly. He kept his own counsel, paid his bills on time, and didn't explain himself to people who hadn't asked a real question. That's part of why the sawmill visits kept getting stranger. He'd started showing up every couple of weeks, walking straight past the good lumber stacked and banded for sale, heading for the reject pile out back. The crooked stuff, the split ends, the short pieces too small to be worth cutting again. He'd stand there for 10, 15 minutes sometimes, picking pieces up, turning them over, tapping them with his knuckle like he was listening for something. Then he'd load what he wanted and leave. He never took everything. That was the part that confused people most. If a man wanted junk wood bad enough to keep coming back for it, why was he so particular about which junk he took? At home, he didn't stack the wood in a pile behind the barn and forget about it. He sorted it. Long, gently bowed boards went one place. Short, cracked pieces went another. Bark-edged offcuts got a pile of their own, and anything with a tight, hard knot he set aside instead of tossing it. Those pieces held together under weight better than the clean ones. He wasn't just grabbing the ugliest wood he could find. He was grading it the way the sawmill graded lumber, only by a different set of rules. He kept a small notebook in his shirt pocket, writing down a length here, a degree of bow there. Whatever he was keeping track of, it looked like more than one building's worth of numbers. His neighbor, Dolores Ostrander, drove past one evening and saw him out there in the fading light, running a tape measure down a warped slab that any sawmill in the state would have thrown in a burn pile. "What in the world are you building, Jack?" "Working on it." That's not an answer. He almost smiled. "No, it ain't." She drove on, more curious than annoyed. She wasn't the only one. By the second month, half of Millhaven had a theory. A hog shelter. A woodshed. Some kind of eccentric old man art project. Nobody guessed right because nobody was asking the question Jack was actually answering. If you've ever seen something everyone else walked past without a second look, you already know there's more to this story than a pile of ugly lumber. So, stick with it. Because the reason Jack wanted these rejects hasn't even been hinted at yet. The ridicule didn't stop. It rarely does, not for a man doing something nobody can explain. At the feed store, a younger farmer named Tobias Vaughn made a show of it in front of half a dozen people. "Heard you're building something out of reject boards, Jack. You know real lumber's not that much more, don't you? You're gonna spend more time fighting cracks and warp than you would just doing it right." Jack paid for his feed and said nothing. Later, an old friend of his, a retired schoolteacher named Wendell Pruitt, put it more gently but no less pointed. "Everybody's asking why you didn't just buy proper lumber, Jack. Sawmill scraps were rejected for a reason. They were rejected for the sawmill's reasons," Jack said. "Not mine." Wendell didn't understand that answer. Almost nobody did yet. Then, in the 9th week, something went wrong. Jack had started framing up a low structure behind the old hay barn, a long, narrow building on posts, open underneath, its walls not yet closed in. One night, a hard spring storm rolled through, wind gusting past 50, and by morning, one whole sidewall had torn loose and folded flat against the ground. Tobias Van heard about it before noon, and made sure everyone else did too. Told him, "Reject wood, reject building." For a few days, Jack didn't go back out to the sawmill at all. People assumed he'd finally given up. His granddaughter, Callie, drove out from town and found him sitting on the porch steps looking at the collapsed wall. "You gonna quit on it, Grandpa?" "No." He turned his notebook over in his hands. "I used the wrong pieces on that wall. Nailed it too tight, too flat. Wood like that needs room to move. I forgot that for about 10 seconds, and it cost me a wall." "Room to move?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he told her about her great-grandfather, a man Callie had never met, who'd built a crib for drying corn back in the hardest years anyone in that family could remember. Years when there wasn't money for planned lumber, let alone new steel. He'd built it out of whatever the mill would part with for nothing. Warped boards, split slabs, the pieces nobody wanted. "Everybody said it'd fall down in a season," Jack said. "It stood 40 years, longer than the barn my grandfather built proper with good lumber and a hired crew. Why'd it outlast a better building?" Jack looked at the fallen wall like it had just answered a question for him, because it wasn't built to be perfect. It was built to breathe. He hadn't lost a wall to bad lumber. He'd lost it trying to force good lumber's rules onto wood that never played by them. That was the mistake he wouldn't make twice. Not on that wall, and not on whatever else he still had planned. Something Jack's grandfather understood 80 years ago was exactly what Jack forgot for one bad night, and it was about to explain everything people had been asking about that pile of reject lumber. He rebuilt the wall. This time, he used the crooked pieces the way his father had. Not fighting their bow, but letting each board's natural curve leave a narrow gap beside the next. No two gaps were quite the same width. Nothing about the wall looked tidy. That was the point. A corn crib doesn't need airtight walls. It needs the opposite. Grain and ear corn stored in a sealed, uniform building sweat, mildew, and rot from the inside before a farmer even knows there's a problem. The old cribs, the good ones, were built with slatted or gapped siding on purpose, so air could move freely through the stored grain and carry the moisture back out before it could do any damage. Straight, uniform, milled lumber has to be deliberately cut and spaced to create that airflow. Every gap sawed in, every board ripped to width. Extra labor and extra waste on wood that was already expensive. Reject lumber does it for free. Every warp, every bow, every uneven edge that made a board worthless to the sawmill was exactly what made it valuable to Jack. Nailed up naturally without fighting the wood's own shape. Those irregular boards left the crib breathing on every wall. No two gaps alike. Air moving through the whole structure the way it needed to. That was the secret nobody at the sawmill had ever thought to ask about. They were grading lumber for furniture and framing, where straight and uniform is everything. Jack wasn't building furniture. He was building something that needed exactly what they were throwing away. That much people eventually figured out. What took longer to make sense of was that the crib went up in 6 weeks, and Jack kept driving to the sawmill for another 2 months after that. By early summer, the pile behind Jack's barn had grown into something people could no longer ignore. Truckload after truckload, the crib kept getting longer, its post and beam frame climbing higher off the ground to keep the stored corn away from moisture and mice. The rough, uneven siding gave it a strange, almost handmade beauty. No two boards matching, every gap a slightly different width. The whole structure looking like it had grown there rather than been built. People stopped asking if he'd lost his mind and started asking what it actually was. Dolores Ostrander was the first to say it out loud, standing at the fence line one afternoon. "That's a corn crib, isn't it? And the old kind." "It is. Nobody builds those anymore." "No," Jack said. "Everybody uses steel bins now. Sealed tight and run a fan to dry it. Works fine most years." Most years. Jack didn't answer that one directly. He just kept nailing. That should have been the end of it. The crib stood finished by the second week of June. Framed, sided, roofed. By any reasonable measure, Jack Coyle didn't need another board. He kept going back anyway. The sawmill worker noticed it first. "Crib's done, isn't it? Saw it from the road." "It is." "So what's all this for?" He nodded at the truck bed, loaded again, mostly short offcuts this time, barely 2 feet long, along with a stack of bark-edged slabs nobody had ever wanted for anything. "Something that goes with it," was all Jack offered. Nobody got more than that. Callie found his notebook on the kitchen table one evening and flipped it open, curious. Page after page of new measurements, not the cribs, which she recognized from the summer. Widths, spacing. A rough sketch of something long and low, running alongside the crib rather than part of it. She had no idea what she was looking at. Behind the barn, before building anything full-sized, Jack framed a single short test section, 8 feet of it, low and slatted, sided with the leftover bark-edged pieces, and left it standing empty for the better part of a week, checking on it morning and evening. Jack wasn't collecting for a project that was already finished. Something else was still coming, and why he still needed all that reject wood. The real reason behind the project came out slowly, the way most true things do in a small town. Not from Jack, but from people putting pieces together on their own. His late wife, Ruth, had grown up on a farm 2 counties over that lost its corn crop, 3 years running to bin damage. Grain gone soft and moldy in sealed steel storage during wet harvests. Money the family never fully recovered. Ruth used to say her father should have built the old way instead of chasing something modern. Jack had never forgotten that. And this past year, after a wet fall and a bin of Tobias Van's own corn turning on him in storage, Jack had quietly decided he wasn't going to let the same thing happen to his grandson, who'd just taken over managing half of Jack's own acreage. A crib that breathed on its own, built from material that cost him almost nothing, was cheap insurance against a bad season, the kind of insurance that couldn't fail from a stuck fan or a power outage. He never announced any of that. He just built it. The corn crib was never the whole story, and the strangest part of what Jack built with all that reject lumber is still ahead. Late summer brought the wettest harvest Mill Haven had seen in a decade. corn came in soaked, no time to let it dry down before it had to come off the field. Half the county's steel bins couldn't keep up. That was when the low, slatted structure running alongside Jack's crib finally made sense. It wasn't a second crib. It was a staging rack, open-sided, raised on the same kind of posts, sided top to bottom with the short offcuts and bark-edged pieces Jack had spent 2 extra months collecting after the crib was done. Freshly picked corn, too wet for long-term storage, got spread there first. A day, sometimes 2. Air moving through every gap left by wood, too short and too rough for anyone else to want. By the time it moved into the crib proper, it had already shed the worst of its moisture. Jack hadn't built one clever structure. He'd built a system, a place to catch the wettest corn before it became a problem, using material too small and too irregular to be worth anything to a mill grading boards for furniture and framing. Tobias Van's bin, the same one that had turned on him once already, started souring within 2 weeks. He drove out to Jack's place without calling first and stood looking at both structures, the crib and the rack beside it. Corn curing dry in one, freshly picked ears airing out in the other. "How much of all that did steel cost you?" Tobias asked. "None of it's steel. Wood, mostly reject lumber from the mill. Nails. Some time." Tobias didn't say anything for a while. He wasn't looking at the crib anymore. He was looking at the rack. Small, ugly, obviously built from scraps and doing a job his steel bin couldn't. "Mine's going bad again." "I heard. Would you build me one?" "Both of them?" Jack studied him for a moment. The same man who'd stood in the feed store telling him he was wasting his time. He didn't bring that up. He didn't need to. What mattered to him was that Tobias was standing in his yard, looking at ugly lumber like it had earned the look. "I'll show you how," Jack said. "You'll need the ugly boards, not the good ones. The mill'll probably give them to you for nothing, same as they gave them to me." Word got back to the sawmill before the month was out. The same worker who'd laughed as Jack's truck rolled out of the yard 8 months earlier came looking for him directly, hat in hand, early one morning before the day's heat set in. "That crib of yours," he said. "Fella from over in Bruner Township was in yesterday, asking if we had more reject lumber like what you'd been hauling off. Said he heard what you built with it." Jack allowed himself something close to a smile. "Funny how that works. We've been burning that stuff for years." "I know." The worker looked past him at the crib and the rack beside it, corn drying clean where a sealed steel bin 2 farms over was quietly failing. It hit him slowly, the way honest realizations do. The mill hadn't been throwing away bad wood. Every board in that pile was perfectly good, just wood that didn't fit what the mill was set up to sell. Straight studs for framing, clean boards for furniture. Anything crooked or short or bark-edged got graded worthless, not because it couldn't do a job, but because it couldn't do theirs. The worker didn't say anything else for a long moment. He didn't need to. Jack never gave speeches about it. He didn't need the town to admit they'd been wrong, and he never brought up the wall that had blown down in the spring, or the men who'd laughed at a loaded pickup truck outside a sawmill. But think back to that first morning, the tapping knuckle, the way he took only some of what everyone else called garbage. Jack was never collecting sawmill rejects. He was picking through good material sitting in the wrong bin, hunting the exact lengths and bow and rough edges a crib and a drying rack would actually use. He knew what he was looking for before he ever loaded that first truck. What he'd known all along wasn't some hidden trick. It was something his father had learned the hard way, in years when there was no other choice, and something the rest of the county had simply forgotten, because good years make it easy to forget. what bad ones teach you. The wood the sawmill called worthless had never been worthless. It just needed someone who remembered what it was for. Have you ever seen something everyone else walk past? Something written off as junk or broken or not worth the trouble? That turned out to be exactly what somebody needed. Tell us about it below. Jack would probably just nod and say he already knew.